Some events in history are so dark that staying silent is the same as siding with the oppressors. One of these events is the Holodomor, a nation, harmless and peaceful, forced into starvation, pushed to the brink of genocide. It was 1932, Ukraine, streets filled with the dead and dying, but here's the shocking truth. The granaries overflowed with grain. Food was abundant, stacked high. Yet on the streets, people were dying of hunger. This was no natural disaster. This was no war. This was a man-made famine, a calculated act of cruelty. Today, we're going to uncover one of the most forgotten, horrifying tragedies in human history. The word Holodomor comes from Ukrainian, meaning death by hunger. Between 1932 and 1933, Soviet policies in Ukraine led to millions of people dying of starvation. But here's the chilling truth. This was not a natural famine. This was a catastrophe designed and enforced by the state, a deliberate plan orchestrated by Stalin and the Soviet regime. And it didn't just strike the peasants. Entire communities were devastated. People couldn't eat the grain they had grown with their own hands. They couldn't carry food from the cities to the villages. They couldn't escape. Every aspect of life was controlled, monitored, and manipulated, and millions perished under this iron grip. So why Ukraine? There's no simple answer. In 1928, Stalin becomes General Secretary of the USSR, introducing the 5-year plan to transform the USSR into a modern economic powerhouse. Selling grain in international markets is an integral part of the plan, providing funds to finance the industrialization and militarization drives. Lenin's Ukrainization policies that promoted Ukrainian language, arts, and culture are reversed. In 1929, forced collectivization throughout the Ukrainian SSR brings all labor and land holdings under state control, prompting protests from farmers. Stalin launches the dekulakization campaign to break the resistance of the successful farmers, the kulaks, and to eliminate them as a class. More than 500,000 farmers and their families are executed, deported to Siberia, or sent to the Gulag camps. Uprisings are widespread. Political and intellectual elites are also deported, jailed, or disappear. It was through these brutal actions that the foundations of the Holodomor were laid. The Holodomor was engineered by the Soviet state through a series of cruel policies that would leave millions dead. The state took control of every aspect of agricultural life. Farmers no longer owned their tools, their animals, or even the seeds they planted. Their independence, their centuries-old way of life, was wiped out overnight. In 1931, Ukraine's wheat harvest is down compared to prior years, yet grain quotas are further increased, forcing collective farms and small farmers to hand over even seed grain reserves set aside for planting. The state demanded impossible amounts of grain from each village. Even the smallest reserves, the grain meant to feed families through the winter, were taken by force. The authorities enforced these quotas with harsh penalties, confiscation of food, imprisonment, and death. In 1932, an internal passport system is introduced. Villagers who tried to escape the famine to other regions were blocked, trains were stopped, borders were sealed. Even leaving your village in search of food was treated as a crime. Children were dying, families were being torn apart. Villages fell silent. Parents, forced to work, sometimes had no choice but to tie their young children to chairs or tables to keep them from harming themselves while they went to labor in the fields. They left a small bowl of food and prayed it would be enough. Historical documents tell a horrifying story. In the Poltava region, NKVD reports from 1933 record scenes that are almost unimaginable. Villages emptied by famine, bodies left in the streets, and survivors driven to desperate measures. According to these reports, and confirmed by historian Ann Applebaum in Red Famine, people were forced to eat their own relatives just to survive. Parents, siblings, even children. Starvation pushed them to this ultimate horror. This was not chaos or random misfortune. This was a calculated result of Soviet policies, turning hunger into a weapon and forcing ordinary people into unspeakable suffering. These people were deliberately starved, victims of genocide orchestrated by the policies of the Soviet regime. According to Stalin, these villagers were enemies of the state, a threat to the very existence of the Soviet Union. And when millions began to die, the regime didn't want the world to know. Stalin went to great lengths to destroy official records, to erase evidence of the famine and its horrifying consequences from history. How many people died? The exact number is unknown because the Soviet authorities deliberately hid the records. Scholars have estimated. Western historians suggest 5 to 7 million. Ukrainian sources estimate 7 to 8 million. No matter which number you take, the reality is the same. This was one of the greatest human catastrophes in history. Millions of people died, surrounded by food, yet left to die intentionally. Today, many claim to stand with Ukraine in the war against Russia. But in 1932-1933, millions of Ukrainians were deliberately starved, and the world largely looked away. So, why was the West silent during that time? We can answer this by looking at the conditions of that time. Back then, some Western journalists were either supporters of the Soviet regime or ideologically biased. Some concealed the truth, while others misrepresented it as a natural famine. Democratic Western governments could not risk jeopardizing trade or political relations with the Soviets, so they chose to remain silent. The economic crisis that began in 1929 still crippled many Western countries in the early 1930s. The Soviet Union was completely closed off to the outside world. With heavy censorship of reports and information, the West could not fully grasp the scale of the Holodomor. Holodomor was not just a famine. It was a man-made catastrophe, magnified by the deafening silence of the world. History seems to echo this lesson. When power and politics are at stake, ordinary people often pay the ultimate price. Many countries have officially recognized the Holodomor as genocide. Yet some remain silent even today, often because they depend on Russia for energy or political reasons. This debate is not just about the past. It shapes the politics of the present. To truly understand the Holodomor is to see the connection between history and power, and to remember the consequences when politics outweigh human life. Holodomor teaches us some harsh truths about humanity and power. What happens when the power of the state is absolute and unchecked? When those in authority can decide who lives and who dies, millions can suffer and no one can stop it. What happens when human beings are reduced to mere numbers on a ledger? When people are no longer seen as individuals, but as statistics to be managed or punished, compassion disappears and cruelty can become routine. Can hunger itself be turned into a weapon? The Holodomor proves that food can be used as a tool of control, oppression, and even genocide. History does more than just recount events. It reveals the logic behind them. It shows us how ideologies, politics, and unchecked power can converge into catastrophe. The Holodomor is a warning to all of us. Silence in the face of injustice is not neutral. Sometimes, silence is the most deadly weapon of all. To understand the Holodomor is to understand the fragility of human rights, the danger of apathy, and the moral responsibility we all share to speak, act, and remember. Holodomor is one of the darkest tragedies in history, forgotten by many but never erased by time. Millions of people were destroyed without a single bullet being fired, erased simply by starvation. This is not only the history of Ukraine. It is a lesson written in human suffering meant for all of humanity. Because when food becomes a weapon, when power goes unchecked, and when the world chooses silence, history does not just repeat itself, it warns us. Remember this: history survives only as long as it is remembered. And forgetting, sometimes, is the final victory of the oppressor. Thank you for watching. If there's a specific period or event in history you'd like us to cover next, Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. There's plenty more history waiting for you.